Hello again. As you get ready to fall asleep, have you ever wondered if a city could have a moment when it can't breathe? Tonight, our story takes place in a city just like that. A city on the verge of suffocation, 19th century London. We're going to learn about an unprecedented event known as the Great Stink, and how a brilliant engineer, through a monumental underground project, not only saved the city, but also laid the foundation for the modern life we know today. All right, go ahead and get comfortable. Our story begins now. June 1858, London. It was a summer that history would never forget. Not for its brilliant sunshine, nor for any grand celebration, but for a terror that was invisible, colorless, yet omnipresent and inescapable. The stench. An unprecedented heat wave had descended upon the city, the largest in the world, trapping it beneath a suffocating glass dome. For weeks, the temperature hovered above 30 degrees Celsius, 86 degrees Fahrenheit. In an age without air conditioning, the heat alone was. But more unbearable than the heat was the odor rising from the city's heart, the River Thames, a smell that seemed to emanate from the very depths of hell. It was a compound stench, a complex horror that no single word could adequately describe. It was a mixture of human excrement, rotting offal from slaughterhouses, chemical waste from tanneries, dregs from breweries, and the untreated sewage temperatura from countless homes and factories. All of it, under the searing summer sun, was violently fermenting, churning, and evaporating into the air. A journalist for the Times attempted to capture this horror in words, writing, "We are not talking about a mere smell, but a thick, almost tangible, deadly vapor. It invades your nostrils, burrows into your lungs, clings to your clothes, and seeps into your food. There is no escape." London, the heart of the British Empire with a population of 2.5 million, the self-proclaimed capital of the world, had, in that summer, become a gigantic, unflushable open-air toilet. And the River Thames, once praised by poets and painted by artists, was well and truly dead. It no longer flowed, it oozed. The water had taken on a sickening, ominous dark brown hue, its surface covered with a thick, greasy film bubbling with foul gases. Some described the Thames of that time as a warm, fermenting bowl of human soup. Citizens clutched handkerchiefs soaked in vinegar or camphor to their faces as they hurried through the streets. Shops kept their doors and windows sealed, attempting to block the odor with heavy curtains, but to no avail. The river ferries suspensioned their services, as boatmen would rather forego a day's wages than spend another minute on that river of hell. The wealthy fled London in droves, escaping to their country estates for refuge. There was, however, one group of people who had nowhere to run. They were the members of the British Parliament, housed in the Palace of Westminster on the banks of the Thames. This magnificent Gothic structure, a symbol of the empire's democracy and glory, became, in that summer, the foulest-smelling workplace in the world. The MPs tried everything to combat the stench. They ordered tons of lime and bleach to be dumped on the riverbanks outside the Houses of Parliament, a futile attempt to mask one ghastly smell with another. It was like throwing a pinch of salt into the sea. Next, they ordered enormous curtains soaked in chloride of lime to be hung over every window. The building looked as if it were holding its own funeral. Yet, when the tide ebbed and flowed, when a breeze drifted in from the river, the penetrating stench effortlessly breached this line of defense, permeating every corner of the debating chambers. Debates were cut short. Committee meetings were impossible to conduct. One MP, in the middle of a speech, was overcome with nausea and rushed out to vomit. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Benjamin Disraeli, lasted only a few minutes in one meeting before fleeing, pale-faced, describing the atmosphere as a Stygian pool, reeking with ineffable and unbearable horror. Finally, on a day in late June, when the stench reached its zenith, the MPs could take no more. They began to fiercely debate an unprecedented motion, to temporarily relocate the entire Parliament and government away from London, to Oxford or St. Albans. The heart of the empire on which the sun never set, its very brain, was about to shut down, unable to bear the smell of its own waste. This public health crisis, known to history by the sardonic name the Great Stink, had, in the most humiliating and unavoidable way, forced a sharp question upon all of Britain. Why had this city, the most advanced and wealthiest in the world, become so filthy, so unbearable, that it was literally unlivable? Was the death of its mother river the inevitable price of an empire's rise? Behind the crisis lay decades of accumulated neglect. To solve it would require the vision of a genius, a revolution in thought, and a magnificent feat of engineering buried deep beneath the streets of London, the likes of which the world had never seen. A story of death and rebirth, a legend of how a great stench ultimately gave birth to modern urban sanitation, was about to unfold in the suffocating fog of the metropolis. The Great Stink of 1858 was not a sudden natural disaster, but a man-made catastrophe decades in the making. It was a subterranean bomb, ticking away beneath the smog of the Industrial Revolution, inevitably destined to detonate. To understand how this bomb was planted, we must travel back in time and observe how three forces, each seemingly a marker of progress, conspired to converge in London, creating a perfect storm of ecological and sanitary disaster. At the end of the 18th century, the engine of the Industrial Revolution was fired up in Britain. Steam engines, textile mills, railroads. These nascent powers acted like giant magnets, drawing people from all over the country, and indeed the world, to London. In 1801, London's population surpassed 1 million for the first time, making it a titan among European cities. By 1851, in just 50 years, that number had more than doubled to 2.36 million. By the time of the Great Stink in 1858, London was a sprawling, overcrowded megacity of over 2.5 million people. This meant that in just over half a century, more than 1 million new inhabitants needed food, clothing, and most critically, were producing a colossal amount of waste that could not simply vanish into thin air. Before the Industrial Revolution, London's waste disposal relied on an ancient and fragile system. Each home had its own cesspool, usually located in the basement or backyard. When the cesspool was full, a special class of workers known as night soil men would collect the solid waste under the cover of darkness, carting it to farms outside the city to be sold as fertilizer. In a way, it formed a small, organic, ecological cycle. However, with the explosive growth of the population, this ancient system collapsed almost overnight. The number of cesspools could not keep up with the population, and the cost of having them emptied was high. Many landlords, to save money, allowed their cesspools to overflow or simply didn't build them at all. Vast quantities of human waste were unceremoniously dumped into streets, backyards, and every available corner of the city. London was becoming, quite literally, a city drowning in its own filth. Just as the city was on the brink of being submerged in sewage, an invention hailed as a symbol of civilization and hygiene began to gain popularity in the homes of London's middle class: the flushing toilet or water closet. In 1775, the Scottish inventor Alexander Cumming patented the first flushing toilet. By the 19th century, with improved technology and lower costs, this novel, clean, and odorless device became an important status symbol for Victorian middle-class families, prodigios their modernity and respectability. But this seemingly wonderful invention delivered a fatal blow to London's sanitation system. Previously, cesspools contained relatively solid waste. The flushing toilet, however, used several gallons of clean water with every flush, turning solid waste into a massive volume of liquid sewage. This caused the already overburdened cesspools to fill up at an unprecedented rate. So where was all this new, immense volume of sewage to go? People naturally turned their attention to London's ancient network of storm sewers. These tunnels were originally designed for a single purpose: to drain rainwater from the streets into the Thames. They were old, small, and completely unequipped to handle sewage. But in 1815, a seemingly progressive law was passed, allowing household sewer pipes to be connected directly to these storm sewers. In 1847, another law went even further, making it mandatory for all homes to do so. This decision was seen at the time as a brilliant solution to the city's filth: out of sight, out of mind. It made every family's backyard cleaner, but it merely shifted the problem from one place to another. It took thousands of scattered sources of pollution and, through a vast network, funneled them all into one final single point of discharge. the River Thames. The Thames was once the lifeblood of London. It provided drinking water, fish, and was the city's main transportation artery. But in the 19th century, it was forced into a new, tragic role: London's central sewer. It is estimated that before the Great Stink, over 400 tons of solid excrement and millions of gallons of sewage were being dumped directly into the Thames every single day through more than 100 sewer outfalls. To make matters worse, London's private water companies were drawing their water directly from this same sewer river. After some rudimentary settling and filtering, this water was sold to the public for drinking. This meant that Londoners were, in effect, drinking a diluted, recycled version of their own and their neighbors' waste. The River Thames was dead. It had become a thick, anaerobic, toxic soup emitting hydrogen sulfide and methane. The fish were long gone. At high tide, sewage from downstream would be pushed back into central London, allowing the pollution and stench to fester and settle in the very heart of the city. These three forces, runaway population, the misuse of technology, and a catastrophic lack of foresight, conspired to push London to the brink. The scorching summer of 1858 was merely the match that lit the fuse. Yet, even as this foul crisis brought London to a standstill, an invisible killer, far more terrifying than the stench, was lurking in the city's drinking water and had been for decades. To understand the great battle for London's salvation that was to come, we must first understand how people of that era viewed disease. And their view was based on a theory that was thousands of years old, deeply entrenched, and utterly wrong. In the London of 1858, the reaction to the stench was more than just sensory disgust. Deep in the public consciousness was a more profound fear, one endorsed by the leading medical authorities of the day. They firmly believed that the foul smell itself was a deadly poison, a vapor capable of causing disease and death, known as miasma. To understand the hero who is about to enter our story, Joseph Bazalgette, and his magnificent creation, we must first navigate this intellectual fog known as the Miasma Theory. For it was this very theory that both created the immense political will to solve the problem and, paradoxically, nearly led everyone Seleucus the wrong direction. The Miasma Theory traces its roots back to Hippocrates, the father of medicine in ancient Greece. He proposed that many diseases, especially epidemics, were not punishments from the gods but were caused by environmental factors. He argued that bad air evaporating from swamps, decaying corpses, or filth was the root cause of illness. In Italian, the term for bad air is malaria, the origin of the word for the disease malaria today. This theory was a monumental step forward, as it attempted to explain disease in naturalistic, rather than supernatural terms. For the next 2,000 years, it was adopted by Galen in ancient Rome, developed by Arab and European physicians in the Middle Ages, and finally reached the zenith of its influence in the industrialized cities of the 19th century. To Victorian doctors and public health reformers, the miasma theory perfectly explained everything they observed. Why were the poor more likely to get sick? Because they lived in crowded, filthy, foul-smelling slums. Why were epidemics more common in the summer? Because heat accelerated the decay of refuse and filth, releasing more miasma. Why did diseases like cholera always concentrate in areas with poor sanitation? The answer seemed obvious. Thus, the word sanitation at the time primarily meant the elimination of bad smells. They believed that if a city was clean and odorless, disease would simply disappear. The famed social reformer Edwin Chadwick was one of the most fervent believers in the miasma theory. It was he who championed the policy of rapidly flushing household waste through pipes and into the Thames, the very policy that led to the Great Stink. In his view, it was the best way to move the source of the miasma away from people's homes. They were so close to the truth, yet so fundamentally wrong. They saw the strong correlation between filth and disease, but they mistook the sensory perception, the smell, for the vector of transmission, ignoring the true culprit. While the miasma theory reigned supreme, a physician named John Snow, an anesthetist by trade, began to harbor doubts, approaching the problem like a lone detective. His crime scene was a terrifying cholera outbreak in London's Soho district in 1854. In just 10 days, over 500 people died of cholera within a small area of Soho less than half a square mile. The symptoms were horrific: violent vomiting and diarrhea, rapid dehydration, skin turning blue, and finally, death in extreme agony. Every other doctor attributed the outbreak to the local miasma, but Dr. Snow, through meticulous, door-to-door investigation, uncovered several anomalies that the prevailing theory could not explain. Anomaly 1. In the heart of the most affected area, there was a brewery where almost none of the workers got sick. Snow discovered that they were given a daily allowance of free beer, so they almost never drank water from the local pumps. Anomaly 2. A widow who lived some distance from the epicenter also died of cholera. Snow painstakingly investigated and learned from her son that she had a particular fondness for the taste of the water from a pump on Broad Street in Soho, and would send a servant to fetch it for her every day. Anomaly 3. At the center of the outbreak area stood a workhouse with over 500 inmates, yet only a handful died. Snow found that the workhouse had its own private well and did not use the Broad Street pump. All the clues pointed to a single suspect, the public water pump on Broad Street. Snow put forth a hypothesis that was shocking at the time. Cholera was not caused by miasma in the air, but by an invisible poison transmitted through water he did not yet know about bacteria. He plotted every single death on a map of the neighborhood. Soon, a map of death emerged, showing with stark clarity that the vast majority of cases were clustered tightly around the Broad Street pump. On September 7, 1854, John Snow went before the local parish board with his map and evidence, urging them to remove the handle from the pump. The board members were skeptical, most of them still believers in the miasma theory. But faced with Snow's detailed evidence and the severity of the crisis, they finally agreed. Once the pump handle was removed and people could no longer draw water from it, a miracle occurred. The cholera outbreak in Soho swiftly subsided. A later investigation revealed the source of the outbreak. A baby living at 40 Broad Street had contracted cholera. The baby's mother had washed its soiled diapers and emptied the water into a leaking cesspool in their basement. This cesspool, it turned out, was less than 3 feet from the well of the ill-fated public pump. The sewage had contaminated the entire water supply. John Snow's investigation is now hailed as a founding event in the science of epidemiology. With rigorous logic and evidence, he had come tantalizingly close to uncovering the truth about cholera. At the time, however, his findings were dismissed by the medical establishment. The prestigious medical journal, The Lancet, even published an article mocking his waterborne theory as nonsense. The vast majority of doctors and scientists remained stubbornly entrenched in their miasmatic beliefs. This was the intellectual landscape of London when the Great Stink arrived in 1858. On one hand, the immense fear of miasma provided unprecedented political momentum for a complete overhaul of London's sewer system. The MPs, unable to bear the stench, were willing to pass a massively expensive public works bill with unheard of speed. On the other hand, this flawed theory meant the project's primary goal was defined as eliminating the smell. The hero of our story, Joseph Bazalgette himself, was also a firm believer in the miasma theory. The beauty of history is that sometimes a group of people, for the wrong reason, can take exactly the right action, and in the end, achieve a victory more magnificent than any of them had ever anticipated. And all of this would be realized through one brilliant engineer and his great subterranean wall. As London was being throttled by stench and fear, as its leaders were clamoring to flee the capital, one name began to be mentioned with increasing frequency. He was not a famous politician or a grandiloquent social reformer, but a pragmatic, resolute, and even somewhat obscure engineer, Joseph Bazalgette. He was about to become the commander-in-chief in the battle for London, a king of the underworld who would build a vast empire beneath the city's feet. Born in London in 1819, Bazalgette was the grandson of a Huguenot immigrant who had fled the French Revolution. This Protestant heritage may have endowed him with an innate tenacity, a meticulous nature, and a devout work ethic. He was trained as a railway engineer, and during the golden age of railroad construction, he amassed invaluable experience in land surveying, structural design, and large-scale project management. His career was not without its struggles. He once suffered a severe nervous breakdown from overwork that nearly killed him, an experience that forged in him a lifelong habit of extreme discipline and prudence. In 1856, a new body called the Metropolitan Board of Works was established, with its primary mission being to solve London's escalating sewage problem. The 42-year-old Bazalgette, with his extensive engineering experience and steady demeanor, was appointed its chief engineer, beating out numerous competitors. He was not a flashy, lightning-in-a-bottle genius. His greatness lay in deeper qualities: unparalleled meticulousness, breathtaking foresight, and an iron will to turn grand blueprints into reality. In the years after his appointment, he submitted several proposals for a new London sewer system, but each plan was repeatedly delayed, revised, or shelved due to its immense cost, technical complexity, and the endless bickering among the various local authorities. Until the summer of 1858, the Great Stink became Bazalgette's most powerful ally. It brutally ended all debate and delay. The MPs could no longer stand working next to a cesspool. In a mere 18 days, a bill granting Bazalgette full authority and a colossal budget of £3 million, an astronomical sum at the time, was miraculously passed by Parliament. Bazalgette finally had the mandate he had dreamed of. He had waited long enough and he had thought long enough. In his mind, a magnificent, unprecedented plan covering all of London was already crystal clear. The core idea of Bazalgette's plan can be summarized in 3 words: intercept, divert, and discharge. He would no longer attempt to clean the Thames. Instead, he would fundamentally prevent sewage from ever entering the urban section of the river. His plan was like a precision military campaign. The Interceptor Legion giant main sewers. He planned to build 5 enormous, brick-lined interceptor sewers deep beneath London, running parallel to the Thames. 3 on the north bank, 2 on the south. These sewers would act as underground highways, the capillary network connecting every home. He would then connect London's existing 1,000 miles of old local sewers to this new system. Like capillaries, they would no longer drain directly into the Thames but would instead flow into the 5 great interceptor sewers. All the city's waste would be caught before it reached the river. Defying gravity, the great pumping stations, the western parts of London were high enough for sewage to flow eastward by gravity. But large areas in the east were at or even below sea level. How to make the sewage flow uphill? Bazalgette's answer was steam power. He planned to build 4 of the world's most powerful steam-powered pumping stations at key points. These stations, with their giant steam engines driving massive pumps, would act like powerful hearts, lifting millions of gallons of sewage to a higher level. The final outfall liberation downstream, the intercepted and lifted sewage would be carried eastward in the main sewers, far away from central London. At Beckton on the north bank and Crossness on the south, the sewage would be held in huge reservoirs. Then, at high tide, the sluice gates would be opened, and the powerful outgoing tide would carry the waste far out into the North Sea, away from the city. The scale and complexity of this plan were almost unimaginable at the time. It would require digging 82 miles, 132 kilometers, of massive tunnels beneath the crowded, built-up city. It would require the firing and use of over 318 million specially made bricks. It would involve excavating over 3 million cubic meters of earth. It would necessitate the use of a brand new building material, Portland cement, prized for its ability to set quickly in damp conditions. When Bazalgette presented this blueprint, many were skeptical. It sounded less like a feasible engineering project and more like one of the mythical labors of Hercules. But Bazalgette, with his characteristic, unshakable calm, set to work. He personally surveyed every street in London, drawing countless detailed maps. His office was piled high with geological samples, material reports, and complex calculations. And it was in the midst of these calculations that he made a decision that seemed minor at the time, but would, over a century later, prove to be the most brilliant and visionary act of his entire career. Hidden within Bazalgette's countless meticulous drawings and calculations was a detail that would elevate him from a merely excellent engineer to an immortal master of urban planning. The decision concerned the diameter of the pipes. His team of engineers, based on their calculations of London's current and foreseeable population growth, had determined the most economical and efficient pipe diameter required to carry all the city's sewage. It was a perfectly reasonable number, sound by all engineering standards. However, when Bazalgette reviewed the report, he picked up his quill and made a change that baffled everyone. On a piece of paper, he wrote a short note, a phrase that would become a celebrated maxim of Victorian engineering. Well, we're only going to do this once, and there's always the unforeseen. And then he took the reasonable pipe diameter calculated by his team, and he doubled it. This decision caused considerable controversy at the time. The soaring cost. Doubling the diameter meant an exponential increase in the amount of earth to be excavated and the quantity of bricks and cement required. In an era when every penny was scrutinized by Parliament, it was a huge financial gamble. Critics accused him of wasting taxpayers' money on an oversized, ostentatious project. The engineering difficulty. Larger pipes meant deeper excavation, more complex structural supports, and higher construction risks. Faced with this skepticism, Bazalgette showed the stubborn and confident side of his character. He calmly explained his logic to the board. London was expanding at a rate beyond anyone's imagination. The future that they could foresee today would likely be insignificant compared to the real future. They were not building a system merely to serve their generation, or even the next. They had to build a permanent work that their great-grandchildren and generations beyond could still rely upon. He insisted that the oversized initial investment was both necessary and wise to solve the problem once and for all. It was a philosophy of investing in the future that was remarkably forward-thinking in an age that often prioritized short-term gains. Ultimately, thanks to the urgency created by the Great Stink and his own unquestionable professional authority, his seemingly wasteful plan was miraculously adopted. A redundant system, far exceeding the needs of its time, was about to be buried beneath London. No one knew for sure if Bazalgette's stubborn decision was right or wrong. The answer would only be revealed more than a century later. In the late 20th century, with London's population well over 8 million and the city transformed, engineers were astonished to find that the main sewer lines built by Bazalgette over 100 years earlier still had about 1/6 of their capacity to spare. It was his decision to double it that allowed this Victorian system, after surviving 2 world wars and the dawn of the information age, to continue serving as the backbone of London's sewerage network. That is the vision of a true master. He was not just designing a pipe, he was designing a city's respiratory system for the next 100 years. He saw not just the numbers on his blueprints, but the relentless, unpredictable, and ever-flowing tide of history itself. With his authority and funding secured, Bazalgette's real challenge was just beginning. He was about to wage a war without gunfire, but one that was just as arduous, a war underground. His enemies were not only London's complex geology, but also the ever-present political and commercial interests on the surface. Challenge 1. The layer cake beneath their feet. London's underground is not a uniform mass of earth. It is a complex geological layer cake of clay, gravel, quicksand, and groundwater. Bazalgette and his team conducted the most detailed geological survey of their time, drilling thousands of boreholes and creating precise subterranean maps. Digging through the hard London clay was relatively safe but slow. The greatest terror was encountering a layer of quicksand, which could flow like liquid into a tunnel, causing it to collapse in an instant, swallowing workers and equipment. Bazalgette had to design special support structures and drainage systems to combat these underground swamps. They also had to navigate a labyrinth of existing gas pipes, water mains, and early underground railway tunnels. Every foot of excavation was like performing delicate heart surgery on the city. Challenge 2. The NIMBYs on the surface. Bazalgette's project had to pass under countless private properties, homes, factories, and railway lines. This inevitably led to conflicts with vested interests. London was in the midst of a railway boom, with companies vying for territory. The new sewers often had to pass beneath busy railway lines. To avoid disrupting service, Bazalgette devised ingenious nighttime construction plans and engaged in countless tough negotiations with railway engineers. Wealthy landowners complained about the noise and vibrations, sometimes taking the Board of Works to court. Bazalgette's legal team spent a great deal of energy fighting these endless lawsuits. Challenge 3: the blood and sweat of the workers. The true builders of this magnificent project were thousands of anonymous laborers. Known as navvies, they were a special class of tough, hard-working men forged in the Industrial Revolution. Their working conditions were incredibly harsh and dangerous. They toiled in dark, damp tunnels for more than 10 hours a day, lit only by candles and gas lamps. The air was thick with moisture and the smell of earth and occasional methane leaks. Cave-ins, explosions, and drowning were a constant threat. Dozens of men lost their lives over the decade of construction, forever entombed within this great subterranean wall. All the work, digging, hauling bricks, laying the tunnels, relied on the most basic human labor. They built Bazalgette's vision inch by inch with their sweat and, sometimes, their lives. Bazalgette was deeply aware of the workers' hardships. He was a frequent presence on the construction sites, wearing mud-caked boots and personally descending into the tunnels to inspect the quality of the work. He enforced strict safety protocols and fought to secure the best possible conditions for his men. He earned not only the respect of his engineers, but also the trust of the men who labored in the dark. In this long battle against nature and human nature, Bazalgette and his vast underground army were changing the very guts of London with unprecedented speed and determination. A massive subterranean revolution to remake the city had officially begun in 1859. Bazalgette's grand project began in earnest across London. For nearly a decade, the entire city was transformed into a massive, bustling construction site. On the surface, a constant flow of horse-drawn carriages and crowds. Below, a revolution of unprecedented scale, aimed at reshaping the city's very lifeblood, was being driven forward in the dark with immense power and resolve. This was more than just a sewer project. It was the zenith of Victorian engineering, a thunderous industrial symphony composed of steam, iron, brick, and human labor. The brick was the fundamental note in this symphony. Bazalgette knew that this deeply buried system had to withstand the immense pressure from the earth and buildings above, as well as the constant corrosion from the sewage within. Therefore, he placed almost fanatical demands on every single brick used, a guarantee of quality. He refused to use the common bricks available on the market. He personally specified the strength, density, and dimensions for the bricks and sourced them only from the finest kilns that could meet his standards. Every batch delivered to the sites underwent rigorous testing. The miracle of 318 million. The entire project ultimately used over 318 million special order bricks. If laid end to end, they would circle the Earth's equator several times. This was supported by a vast production and logistics network. Countless kilns fired bricks day and night. Countless barges and carts transported these red blood cells to every corner of the city. The perfect arch. Inside the tunnels, skilled bricklayers, working in dim light, used their exquisite craftsmanship to lay these bricks into perfect, smooth, egg-shaped or circular arches. This structure not only distributed pressure most effectively, but its smooth interior also prevented waste from clinging to it, ensuring a free flow. Bazalgette's standards for the brickwork were exceptionally high. The Portland cement mortar between the joints had to be full and even, with no flaws. He believed that details determined the success of this century-long project. Excavating the tunnels was the most arduous and spectacular part of the entire endeavor. Bazalgette and his engineers employed two primary methods, depending on the geological conditions: cut and cover. In more open areas with fewer surface buildings, such as along the New Victoria Embankment, they used this method. Workers would dig a massive trench from the surface, like slicing open the city's skin. They would then build the brick tunnel at the bottom, and finally backfill the earth to restore the surface. This method was safer but had a huge impact on surface traffic and the environment. Many of London's main thoroughfares were turned into giant trenches for years. Tunneling. When crossing through the densely built-up, narrow streets of central London, the more challenging tunneling method was necessary. Workers descended through vertical shafts and then, like ants gnawing through bone, dug forward inch by inch in the darkness. While modern tunnel boring machines didn't exist, workers used a primitive form of a tunneling shield, made of wood or iron, to temporarily support the earth in front of them and prevent collapse. The greatest danger, besides cave-ins, was methane gas. This colorless, odorless gas, when met with the open flame of a candle or gas lamp, could cause a violent explosion. To counter this, gas detectors were employed to test the tunnels with a Davy lamp each morning. Even so, accidents still happened. If the tunnels were the system's veins, the 4 great steam pumping stations were its powerful, beating hearts. These stations were themselves masterpieces of industrial age aesthetics, a perfect fusion of power and art. The grandest and most famous of these was the Crossness pumping station on the south bank of the Thames. The Cathedral of Sewage. Bazalgette did not see this as a mere functional building. He hired the best architects of the day to design its interior as a magnificent industrial cathedral in the ornate Victorian style. Soaring cast iron columns were painted in vibrant reds, greens, and blues, adorned with intricate floral and geometric patterns. The spiral staircases and railings were all elaborately crafted. The entire space was grand and opulent. Bazalgette believed that a great public work should also be a thing of beauty, something to make the people who built it proud. The 4 giants at work. In this splendid hall stood 4 of the largest single-cylinder rotative beam engines in the world. They were named after Queen Victoria's husband and children, Victoria, Albert Edward, Alexandra, and Prince Consort. Each engine weighed over 230 tons, with a flywheel more than 27 feet in diameter. When steam from the boilers was fed into the giant cylinders, these metal behemoths would begin to move with a slow, rhythmic grace. The immense beams and crankshafts drove 52-ton pumps up and down, lifting the low-lying sewage from southeast London a full 30 feet into the final outfall reservoirs. Their mighty roar and rhythmic breathing sounded like 4 captive giants, a raw and awesome display of industrial power. One of the most challenging parts of the project was running several of the main interceptor sewers across the bed of the River Thames itself. For instance, sewage from the south bank had to be transported to the system on the north bank. Bazalgette's team used giant caissons to create temporary dams on the riverbed, pumped the water out, and then constructed massive cast iron pipes in the dry. This process was slow, expensive, and at the mercy of the tides and weather. For nearly a decade, Londoners lived with the daily reality of excavation, noise, and dust, witnessing their city undergo a radical internal organ transplant. Most of them probably had no idea what was happening beneath their feet, nor did they grasp the full significance of the project. But they would soon feel the revolutionary changes with their own breath and in their own health. In 1865, the first and most critical phase of the project was completed. At a grand ceremony, the young Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, personally turned the wheel to start the engines at Crossness Pumping Station. A new, powerful, hidden London was born, and the era ruled by the stench was finally coming to an end. When Bazalgette's subterranean system began to operate, its effect on London was immediate, even miraculous. The victory was far more glorious and profound than anyone had initially imagined. It not only won a war against a foul stench, but, unintentionally, it won a far more significant war against pestilence. The most direct change was sensory. As the sewage from millions of homes was silently funneled away from the city by the great interceptor sewers, the River Thames, once the city's toilet, began its long, slow process of healing. The stench vanished. An extreme event like the Great Stink never happened again. London's air, though still polluted by industrial coal smoke, was finally free of the suffocating, putrid smell rising from the river. People could open their windows again and breathe freely. Rebirth of the Mother River. By the 1870s, the water quality of the Thames had improved dramatically. Fish that had been absent for decades, such as salmon and eel, began to reappear in the urban stretches of the river. The sacrificed Mother River after its death was reborn. The riverbanks, under Bazalgette's planning, were transformed into wide, beautiful public promenades like the Victoria Embankment, becoming new recreational spaces for London's citizens. However, the project's greatest and most dramatic achievement lay in a field that Bazalgette himself had not anticipated: public health. Remember, Bazalgette and all the key decision-makers of his time were believers in the Miasma Theory. Their primary motive for building this colossally expensive system was to eliminate the bad air they believed caused disease. But when the system began to function, completely separating the sources of clean drinking water, drawn from upstream of the city, from the contaminated sewage system, a miracle occurred. In 1866, a final major cholera outbreak occurred in London's East End, but the epidemic was magically confined to a relatively isolated area that had not yet been connected to Bazalgette's new system. Its residents were still drinking contaminated water. The areas that were already served by the new system remained safe. This outcome was like a bolt of lightning, illuminating the fog of old theories. It provided the most irrefutable, large-scale, macroscopic evidence for John Snow's waterborne theory, which had been ridiculed for over a decade. Although Robert Koch would not identify the cholera bacterium for another 17 years, the facts on the ground had proven it beyond doubt. The real enemy was not the miasma in the air, but an invisible poison in the water. Bazalgette's project became a wonderful, ironic milestone in the history of public health. A group of people firmly believing in the miasma theory built a system to eliminate a smell, but in doing so, they created the evidence that utterly destroyed the miasma theory and perfectly validated its rival, the germ theory of disease. Perhaps it was one of history's kindest jokes. It shows us that sometimes the right action can have a value that far surpasses its original, flawed motivation. The immense success of the project brought Joseph Bazalgette supreme honor. In 1875, he was knighted by Queen Victoria. The once obscure engineer became a hero of the British Empire. His name was recorded in the annals of history alongside those of great generals and statesmen. Sir Joseph Bazalgette continued to serve London's public works until his death in 1891. His life was a perfect embodiment of the finest Victorian engineering spirit. Rigorous, pragmatic, tenacious, and possessing a profound sense of responsibility that transcended his era. His legacy is not just the magnificent network of pipes that still flows silently beneath London today. He left behind a fundamental philosophy for how a modern city can coexist harmoniously with its own metabolism. A global impact. London's success provided a model for large cities all over the world. In the following decades, Paris, Hamburg, New York, Boston, and many others adopted Bazalgette's principles to build their own modern urban sanitation systems. In a sense, Bazalgette not only saved London but also indirectly brought healthier, more civilized lives to hundreds of millions of city dwellers across the globe. Today, as you stroll through the streets of London, walk along the wide Victoria Embankment, and admire the sparkling waters of the Thames, you may not realize that dozens of feet beneath you, a vast subterranean world forged from over 300 million bricks is silently and faithfully carrying away the troubles of this great metropolis at a rate of tons per second. This system is the most precious legacy that the Great Stink of 1858 left to London. It is a living parable, telling the story of how a city, pushed to its limits and on the verge of being consumed by its own filth, redeemed itself through courage, ingenuity, and foresight. It proves that the greatest crises humanity faces often contain the seeds of the greatest leaps in civilization. Sometimes an unbearable stench can, in the end, give birth to a healthier, greater, and more resilient modern city. And Sir Joseph Bazalgette, the king of the underworld, used brick and mortar to write, Beneath the Feet of London, a magnificent epic of vision and responsibility, a story that continues to be told to this day.